Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. We are here to address the current encampment problem and present a solution to transition people out of them. My name is Homeira Afshar from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, and I'm joined by Lisa Alers-Hankey from the Ministry of Health, Josh Marando from the Ministry of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Tory Dockree from the Ministry of Infrastructure. Next slide. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that I'm calling in from. The land Toronto occupies sit on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississauga of the Credit River. As we discuss an issue that disproportionately harmed Indigenous people, we must recognize the colonial history that brought us here and allow us to work and gather on this land. Next slide. Ontario has been dealing with homelessness for years. In the past 2 years, COVID-19 and the current housing affordability have intensified this problem, which has caused a rise in outdoor sleepers and erecting tents in public places. This has resulted in negative impact on encampment residents as well as local communities and has put more pressure on the service deliverers. We are here to address the challenge brought by the increase in encampment and rough sleeping. Next slide. Our focus today is on the people who are chronically homeless, meaning they have been homeless for at least 6 months. These people most likely end up being rough sleepers or residing in encampment and are in urgent need to access permanent housing. Looking at the bigger picture, based on the systematic count that Ontario conducted in 2018, from more than 21,000 people which were experiencing homelessness across the province, 55% were chronically homeless. The province later reported that on any given night, approximately 9,600 Ontarians experience visible homelessness, such as living in a shelter. Also, there has been a demographic shift in population seeking shelter, expanding from largely single men to youth, women, and families. Reports indicate that 35% of people experiencing homelessness, both outdoors or in the shelter system, were women, while LGBTQ+ form 30% of the total population. Homelessness also affects Indigenous people disproportionately, representing 3% of the population in Ontario. They represent 35% of the provincial unhoused population. Due to the rise in homelessness in recent years, the average days of stay for all shelters users in the province has increased around 30%. Only in Toronto, shelter usage experienced a rise of 80%, while in Ottawa, the use of family shelter saw a close increase of 70%. The focus of Ontario's current strategy has been to move the whole homeless population along the continuum through current policies and programs. Now I'll pass it to Lisa to take us through the causes and consideration to further understand our issue.
Thank you, Homeira. Next slide. We are talking today about encampments, but it's linked to larger issues in the system, and our solution will address the whole system. Gaps in the system have led to 3,000 people residing in encampments in 2021, which is only a portion of the homelessness issue and emblematic of larger problems. We've especially seen an increase in rough sleeping and encampments as a result of the initial reduction in spaces due to social distancing requirement, increased violence, and high rate of COVID in shelters. The conversion of hotels into shelters rapidly increased bed space. For example, in May 2021, the City of Toronto had procured enough hotel temporary shelter beds for all people in encampments. However, they did not address the service gap, so the hotel model was not enough to meet the individual needs, and many residents remained in encampments. To understand better why people live in encampments, the City of Toronto conducted an encampment engagement survey in March 2021 and found that nearly 45% of respondents felt both a greater sense of belonging and greater privacy in encampments. Encampments exist outside of the policy framework and make it more difficult to connect people with the services and supports they need. Next slide. In order to address the gaps in the system, we must recognize that the complex jurisdictions shared among our partners across orders of government and outside of government each play a vital role. In Ontario, the province takes the lead on housing and homelessness, but unlike other provinces, the municipalities take the lead on housing service delivery. Social housing units, as well as emergency and transitional shelters, are operated by municipalities, housing cooperatives, and nonprofits. These will be essential in building a suitable response to the encampment challenge. The federal government primarily funds permanent housing, providing 2/3 of the funding for housing programs in 2021. Their support is an important factor to finding solutions, as their funding programs are essential to our current and future response. The province provides funding to the municipalities and providers through programs like the Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative and investments in supportive housing. The province also acts as a lever, transferring funding from federal government to municipalities through provincial transfers. The costs are shared as the municipalities spend their own funds on homelessness programs and can also receive direct transfers from the federal government under programs like Reaching Home and the Wrapping Housing Initiative. This shows that the coordination between our partners is not only necessary, but provides a real opportunity for a strong and comprehensive response. Next slide. We could just see this issue as getting people out of encampments and into our current system, but this is an issue that's so much more than that. The entire system is under pressure. We need solutions that look at both what brought people into encampments and what's going on and will continue to strain the system past COVID-19. The demand for supportive housing outstrips supply, with long wait lists for supportive housing and shelters operating near capacity for years. There's a critical problem of service misalignment. People want privacy, they have desire for community, and high barriers like sobriety requirements attract people from addressing services and shelters. Furthermore, we need to address the unique needs of the different groups we support. People who are Indigenous, LGBTQ, women, families, and other groups have specific needs, and a one-size-fits-all approach is not enough. There's a lack of comprehensive and real-time data on the exact number of rough sleepers in encampment residents. And importantly, we do not have data on the services that people require. It's hard to reduce service misalignment without knowing the full extent or precise needs of those outside the current system. Navigation of services and supports takes place at shelter intake rather than a preemptive reaching out to individuals. This also takes place at individual shelters rather than a centralized navigation strategy across the province. Funding and services is disjointed among orders of government, which is coupled with differing approaches by police, service providers, municipalities, and provinces when addressing homelessness and encampment. Next slide. We propose that the province strengthens the entire homelessness system and addresses the capacity and misalignment gaps addressed. This would achieve the vision of aligning with the needs of encampment residents, being responsive to the needs of the whole homelessness community, coordinating to leverage the expertise of our partners, providing a streamlined system of flexible delivery, and expanding the housing capacity. Next, Josh will discuss our options.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Next slide. To achieve our vision, we need to reframe how we coordinate our approach to encampments and fill necessary gaps. We've investigated several approaches and ultimately come up with 3 nested options that build on each other to focus on different points of a resident's journey out of an encampment. Our first option focuses on enforcement, which is our first point of interaction with encampment residents. And here we'll work with municipalities to develop flexible encampment response protocols. This would be effective at getting people out of encampments, but it does fall short in addressing those gaps in navigation and service alignment. So though an important part of a comprehensive approach, we ultimately do not recommend this option alone. In our second option, we'll take that enforcement focus and add onto it a focus of transition, leveraging provincially supported navigation centers and a data collection framework to improve our supports in transitioning people out of encampments. This allows us to build on option 1 to remove barriers and match people with more appropriate services. But it does fall short in addressing the issue of our service offering misalignment and capacity challenges. Finally, our recommended option takes both option 1 and 2 and nests them together while adding onto that expanded housing options. Here we make sure that what we're transitioning people to provides stability and flexibility to meet their needs and prevents them from falling back into an encampment after a temporary shelter stay. This is done by engaging in a coordinated effort with all our partners to increase capacity and the supply of permanent supportive housing. Option 1 brings people out of encampments. Option 2 adds on to that and brings people into our system. And then the recommended option does both and also brings people to stable housing. This allows the province to not only support encampment residents by finding temporary shelter, but also finding options that meet their own needs and, more importantly, finding home. Next slide. In order to achieve this, we need to make sure our option decreases alienation from the system, encouraging encampment systems to enter the system in the first place, while also building sustainable capacity so they have a dignified and stable option to go to. Our encampment response protocol will build trust and understanding so the system is able to help those most in need of support. We'll build sustainable capacity by learning from models that have already proved to be successful and use barrier-free rent gear to income housing so that no matter what situation someone is in, they have access to supports. Finally, we'll use data to track capacity, improve supports, and better connect people to those supports. This improves pathways into shelter by removing barriers. It's responsive to the concerns of neighboring communities by restoring public space, and it's robust and adaptable to understand the changing needs of our community and leverages our partners for a coordinated and streamlined response. Next slide. We've ensured that the recommended approach is comprehensive to get at those core issues of alienation and capacity. Decreasing alienation will come from our navigation centers and encampment response, which works with municipalities together with important partners in our response protocol to be led by navigation outreach teams, with everybody sharing the common priority of the safety of both the people experiencing homelessness and the surrounding communities. This lets those in low-risk encampments stay in place until appropriate housing is found and diverts them to shelters quickly when the risk is high. We'll address capacity through data collection, as well as our new accelerated permanent supportive housing build program, where we will connect with municipalities and service providers to act as site sponsors and operators to make sure that housing is built and operated to fulfill the needs of our most vulnerable communities. Infrastructure Ontario will use their expertise in the procurement and development process, and will work with the federal government in developing new cost share arrangements that leverage existing programs across orders of government to reach our shared goals, achieving rapid and high quality results. Next slide. So here you can see our first two options are strong at addressing those most immediate issues of the problem. But we know this issue existed before COVID and will persist after. So ultimately, they don't go far enough to truly meet the needs of those in encampments and address the reasons for being there in the first place. The recommended option builds on this enforcement and transition focus to make sure that there's not only a quick and effective transition from encampments, but they have a place to go after that is stable, suitable, and accessible. With this, people are supported throughout their transition from encampments, finding options that truly meet their needs today and in the future, ultimately supporting people in finding home. Now, Tory will walk us through the implementation.
Thanks, Josh. And next slide. We envision all of the programs within this option being negotiated in the form of provincial municipal service delivery plans. This will recognize municipalities as the province's frontline service providers and accommodate their need for flexible service implementation. A service delivery plan will allow the province to obtain a reliable commitment from municipalities while maintaining flexible delivery and funding options that can be tailored to each municipality. We know that in presenting the recommended option, there are many implementation considerations that need to be taken into account. These include navigation centers, which will be built in a flexible manner to identify specific funding and resource requirements. Funding supports for municipalities delivering these services will be provided through the Ontario Community Homelessness Prevention Initiative, and more robust province-wide data collection, which will be conducted in partnership with the Multi-Ministry Supportive Housing Initiative to build on their existing efforts and collect data at more points of service. This will be conducted with the aim of leveraging the expanded by name lists to match those most in need with the available funding. Next slide. Moving on to costing. It is estimated that the midterm goal of building 3,000 hotel to housing conversions and 1,000 modular housing units will cumulatively cost $225 million. In the long term, the construction of all 10,000 supportive housing units is projected to cost $570 million. In the new coordinated cost share agreements, the Government of Ontario will be responsible for 1/3 of the projected costs, or roughly $190 million for all 10,000 units. This will be the cost irrespective of the proportion of units intended for Indigenous people. Next slide. In terms of timelines, We believe that the majority of the project can be completed by 2024, with mainly supervision and continued construction required until 2030. Both data collection and navigation centers will require consultation with provincial partners in the short term and will be rolled out in the medium term and expanded to all of the province's high need areas prior to 2024. This will allow us to focus on key performance indicators and make any needed adjustments moving forward. Regarding permanent supportive housing, the short term will see the government negotiate cost sharing and funding. The medium term will see the delivery of the 4,000 permanent supportive housing units, with a long-term plan of building 10,000 units by 2030. Next slide. So there are several risks that accompany the recommended option. The largest risk is that we may not have the local service delivery capacity required to deliver these programs. This will be accounted for by focusing on local operators' pressure points within the service delivery plans and providing additional operational support and funding to increase staffing and resource capacity to relieve the pressure. A second significant risk is that the federal government may not participate in the program. This will be mitigated by collaborating through the project development and using existing programs to reinforce our shared priorities to further both our objectives. That being said, there are also risks surrounding community dissatisfaction and legal challenges that will be addressed throughout the implementation process. Next slide. An essential piece of this plan is determining how the province will communicate their agenda with different stakeholders. This slide illustrates key messages that the Government of Ontario will target to different groups. These will reassure encampment residents that they will be transitioned to permanent housing, inform neighborhoods surrounding encampments that there will be relief and that the government will be restoring public spaces, and clearly state that the province will actively collaborate with the federal and municipal governments. Next slide. Today, we have outlined a clear strategy for transitioning people out of encampments in a way that suits their needs through the recommended enforcement, transition, and expanded housing option. The recommended strategy is responsive to the needs of communities and leverages partnerships at all jurisdictional levels. It is aimed towards a streamlined and flexible delivery process that will expand the province's supportive housing capacity. Ultimately, we hope to meet these residents where they are and end the need for encampments. Thank you very much for your time, and we are happy to take any questions.
Well, members of the Tiger team, thank you for your presentation. I'm the chair of this central agency management team that's responsible for this file. I'd like to turn to my colleagues for some questions and follow up on what you've said. I'll start first with Pam McCurry.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was very helpful. You've got a challenging set of problems here, and particularly what I'm interested in is thinking about the partnerships, in particular with the federal government. And as part of this, I always wonder kind of what kind of motivation, what will inspire them to action? They're already spending a great deal of money. They've already got a particular focus for that money. Are you aware what are the jurisdictional imperatives for the federal government? Do they have jurisdiction in the area, and are there any legal obligations that they have that might inspire them to work with us closely?
Yeah, for sure. So, oh, sorry. Yes, great question. Something that we really are trying to do is leverage all the partners for that coordinated response, because we do know that jurisdiction overlaps. So in terms of that first question of what will inspire government, and they are already spending a lot of money, so will they participate in this? That's really why we're trying to focus on those shared goals and leveraging the existing commitments. So for example, one of our more ambitious approach, our ambitious recommendations, is the Permanent Supportive Housing Accelerated Build Program. But the federal government saw a lot of uptake with their Rapid Housing Initiative, initially allocating $1.5 billion and then doubling that this past budget, this past budget cycle. So there is funding within that program, and we're building off of previous programs like the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program to work through cost share arrangements and through that cost share arrangement negotiation to make sure that we're building off of previous partnerships that have worked quite well. And also it's important to involve the federal government and municipalities and communities when looking at how we're supporting Indigenous folks. Because we do know that Indigenous support is part of the government's jurisdiction as well. So we want to make sure that we're supporting them, looking at and working within their goals and working together to highlight our common priorities and really utilize and optimize the resources that have already been committed, because we know that across all orders of government, there has been a lot of resources committed to addressing this issue. What we're trying to do is coordinate those resources and direct them to where they're needed most, working with people within their shared responsibilities to leverage our abilities as different orders of government most effectively.
Thank you very much, Pam. Any follow-up on that, or shall I move to another person?
No, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, I'll turn now to my colleague, Alan Northcott. Alan, any questions for the Tiger team?
Yes, I do have a question, but thank you for the presentation. I know this is a complex issue. We've been trying to come to grips with it for a while. I appreciated the comments at the beginning about chronic homelessness and the context that you set for us, but I'm curious to know a little bit more about the extent to which research like that or other kinds of research played a role in the solutions that you're recommending to us. And at the same time, what kinds of unanswered questions does your look at the research generate?
Team, who wants to answer that one?
I think I can speak to that.
Okay.
Thank you. So a lot of the issue with the research is that there isn't a province-wide initiative where all municipalities are collecting kind of the same information, and moreover, different organizations. So I mean, touching to what we talked about in the deck, or alluding to what we talked about in the deck, different organizations collect information. So a lot of the information that is currently collected in Ontario is collected at the shelter level, or the municipal level, or by kind of our non-governmental partners who are delivering these services. The issue is that there's not a lot of communication between the data that is collected amongst service providers and with the province. So what we're looking to do is to expand who actually asks these questions and ensuring that kind of smaller municipalities throughout the province are collecting the same data as the larger municipalities that kind of have more funding resources in these areas, and that there's open collaboration amongst the service providers, the municipalities, and the province to ensure that everyone has access to all of the information that we need to determine the gaps in our service funding and address them moving forward. In terms of questions that we don't know, it's really difficult to gain information surrounding people who particularly are rough sleepers and are staying in encampments, because as we mentioned, they oftentimes don't access the shelter system. So while we can gain information about people who are accessing point of services such as shelters on any given night, it's much more difficult to actually determine how many people are rough sleeping or in encampments. And one of the ways that we propose mitigating this risk is collecting the information at a variety of points of service, not just in shelters. So in places like food banks with caseworkers, really collecting and expanding those by name lists and ensuring that the information is collected at a variety of points of service as opposed to just shelter, and then creating a provincial plan to coordinate and collect the information so that all orders of government and our partners can have access to this coalesced information and actually use the data to readjust and reframe our service options to suit the needs of this vulnerable community.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll turn now to another of my colleagues, Trina Fraser. Trina, do you have a question for the Tiger team?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for an amazing presentation. So you mentioned a lot about supports needed throughout your presentation, and I want to look specifically in one of the topics you talked about was you mentioned one such as nonprofit. My question would be, what skills would one need to best support the needs of the people in this crisis?
Who on the Tiger team wants to take that up? What skills would you want to see in the nonprofits to best meet the needs of the people involved in this crisis?
I can address that. So one of the great things about the nonprofit system already is there are organizations for a multitude of different needs. What we're suggesting is integrating this into a broader system and providing more supports and also formalizing some supports. For example, 10% of service workers are Indigenous. So these people have the best capacity to support culturally appropriate solutions for Indigenous people. For example, there's other nonprofits that support families. This support would be great to integrate into family supports as well. So the needs would be lived experience, would be culturally appropriate, and current information on how to address the particular needs. As we mentioned earlier in the presentation, the shelter system initially was designed to address the problem of single men experiencing homelessness. However, over time, the system hasn't adapted to the unique needs of the people who are currently using it, which would lead to our response having different wings or different locations for different groups. So women may be in a separate location than men, families can stay together, and that will also allow the fostering of communities, which was another reason that people would choose encampments.
Okay, thank you very much. Trina, any follow-up on that? The floor is yours if you want.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, let me turn back then. Pam McCurry or Alan, or again, Trina, any further questions we want to put to the Tiger team? We've given us a very concise presentation and we're full of ideas. Pam.
No, not specifically. Thank you.
Alan?
Nothing comes to mind. Thank you, though.
Let me ask one question to the team then. I'm sorry, Trina. Sorry, forgive me. Trina, over to you. Any further questions from your point of view?
Now, just to follow up, I want to say thank you for addressing the culturally appropriate need. Thank you.
And I'll just, we've got a bit of time, so I will ask a question. In your presentation, you focused obviously on the challenges facing the homeless and the sleepers. I didn't hear much from you about dealing with community impacts of encampments. Does anyone in the Tiger team have anything to tell us about how to deal effectively with the community impacts of encampments and basically restoring some kind of harmony between the wider community and the people who are rough sleeping?
I can take this one, thank you. So we really think this is a delicate balance because we do have to recognize the needs of different communities, and that communities surrounding encampments want access to their park space again, but that people in encampments also deserve to have a safe place to go and live. And the shelter system isn't meeting their needs. So we're suggesting a readjusted approach that may not clear encampments kind of immediately. So we're intending on separating encampments based on high and low risk and prioritizing high risk encampments to clear them faster, using our strategic outreach teams where the main supports will be caseworkers and social workers and culturally appropriate frontline homeless support workers who are trained in kind of harm reduction and dealing with people who have these kinds of lived experiences to transition them justly into existing shelter supports as quickly as possible. In the midterm, we're going to be, or while we're doing that, we're going to be conducting and building these transition centers. And so while we're hoping to expand that really quickly within the year and maybe end up keeping some of the lower risk encampments, residents where the shelter system really doesn't suit their needs, allowing them to stay in encampments for a longer period of time, potentially a couple of weeks, maximum a couple of months, while we build the necessary supports to transition them appropriately. And we're thinking especially of families in this instance and members of the LGBTQ community where the shelter system really doesn't meet their needs. So allowing them to stay in encampments where their needs are currently being met, while we can transition them appropriately to the necessary or to appropriate supports such as our transitional centers. However, we do recognize that surrounding communities want access to their park space. And so we're going to work, that's really in the communication strategy piece, to ensure that the encampments are transitioned as quickly as possible in a just manner, and really communicating with communities that we're supporting people in encampments and gaining access or allowing them to have access to their park space as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Tiger team. We appreciate the presentation very much.